Middle Ages begins to wane when there is the creation of the university. Universities are places of learning in which scholars can congregate. Books that had previously been unavailable because most of the population had been illiterate now began to flow from the Middle East, where there were universities, to Europe because of the work of Italian traders. Italian sailors would travel from Rome and other places in Italy, Venice, Florence, and they would travel then to the Middle East, and they would meet with Arab scholars, and these people would trade books, ancient manuscripts that had been sitting in Arab libraries for nearly 1,000 years, that had been traded with the Greeks and the Romans, but had not been picked up in a long time, back to the Italians. The Italians would bring back these Greek and Roman texts, and people in Europe began to read in Greek and Latin, and began to realize something they did not know before, that there was a vibrant civilization that had existed for centuries prior to the Middle Ages. And this was this reawakening, an understanding of a new consciousness that arose that became known as the Renaissance. One of the first places of learning was Paris, and as you can see in the background, one of the great cathedrals here is Chartres Cathedral. I've been there this year in Paris. You can see it has two spires of two different levels. One spire is a little higher than the other spire, and the reason why it's higher is one was burned and had to be rebuilt, and it was rebuilt in the next century. So the actual spires are built at two separate times, and they're put together into a beautiful building, and inside it's a very holy environment. People go in, it's still a working church. There's still people giving ceremonies and Catholic Mass in Chartres Cathedral. It's downtown in Paris. It's near the Parliament, and it's a very beautiful spot. And a lot of business and a lot of gorgeous environment artworks and things are all around Chartres Cathedral. It's quite beautiful. Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris. And next to that is just a picture of the Louvre. I wanted to show you one of the contemporary beautiful architectural monuments in Paris. The Louvre is one of the great museums of the world, and this is the lights at the Louvre at night. You can see it's sort of a glass pyramid that rises out of the ground. And a lot of the Louvre is underground, a lot of it is above ground, but you can there's actually underground stories where you can actually go and look at art down below ground there. So it's quite beautiful. There are great writers that begin to write in the Renaissance, and people begin to read a lot more. One of the earliest writers is Dante. He writes the epic poem, the Inferno, and he describes mankind above ground, on this world, going to the other world, going to heaven, and also going to hell. So Dante's The Inferno, part of his the Divine Comedy, describes sort of the adventure allegorically of mankind and what happens when mankind moves on. Do they move on to the better world, or do they move on to the world below? And it's obviously a metaphorical story to try to help people to become good people. And there are a lot of paintings about, as you can see behind us, of the Dante's Inferno that give us this sense of which decisions will people make. So, of course, in the late Middle Ages, moral decisions are big decisions because, again, religion is central to people's lives. Their day-to-day life is generally tempestuous. It's very easy to die young from disease, from pestilence. A broken arm can turn to gangrene and can kill a person. So, so simply having a good quality of life is very, very difficult. People focus on the afterlife. They focus on what's to come next. Today, because the quality of life is generally good, people focus on the world here. They don't focus on the next world as much, although maybe sometimes they should. And as you can see, you have a variety of pictures of the saints, and probably the most famous of the saints for our era anyhow is St. Thomas Aquinas. And St. Thomas Aquinas is one of the first people who really champions knowledge and learning. Up until that point, in the Middle Ages, in the late Middle Ages, before St. Thomas Aquinas, people were just told to be good. And if you were good, God, Jesus would love you and would save you for your goodness. But Aquinas basically realized the growth of print the growth of literacy and how important it was for people to sort of have knowledge unto themselves, that if they read the Bible themselves, they would have a greater opinion, they would understand ecclesiastical issues better, they would understand the ideas and the workings of heaven better, and it would make them better Christians. So unlike a lot of people who were afraid that learning would make people a little bit more obstinate, which it certainly did, by the way, when printing actually arrives in 1450, when Gutenberg creates the printing press and the price of books drop, there's immediately debate. By 1520, in the middle of the Renaissance, the Northern Renaissance, Martin Luther is basically saying we have to break from the Catholic Church because any man has the right and the ability to read the Bible and can learn as much about God himself as the Pope can tell him. And King Henry VIII, prior to that, has actually already broken from the Catholic Church and just said, now that I can read for myself and understand how things work, I don't see any reason to obey someone in a foreign country. So again, the growth of knowledge is great. People like St. Anselm and St. Thomas Aquinas do permit the idea that knowledge is good, and if people can learn more, they can become more holy and more sacred, and they can become closer to God. And again, this was sort of a new idea growing out of the late Middle Ages that really spurs on the growth of the Renaissance that comes just a few years later. And this is one of the fantastic cathedrals on the inside. As you can see, this is Notre Dame in Paris, and you can see the marvelous ribbing here at the top of the building, and you can see these marvelous glass windows on all sides that create light to flood into the building. And again, having been in here, there's this great central nave, which is the central corridor of the church that goes down through the center of the church, and at the end we have more stained glass here, and then all the people that are parishioners are here, and people just come to pray. And people come from around the world to Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris simply to pray and to become holier and to be closer to God. And obviously it's something that they thoroughly enjoy, and it gives them a sense of peace. It's a pilgrimage, and as you can see, the building is really suffused with light because of the marvelous, what they call the clear story, the second story then. And again, the reason why they were able to build these buildings taller than they were able to build these buildings in the Greek and Roman times is because they had discovered the idea of having sort of a wooden frame, putting cement or concrete around that wooden frame to support it, using the flying buttresses so that they could allow the walls to kind of bend out a little bit, and then use these flying buttresses or supports on the outside that would sort of force the walls back in. So you have, again, these two opposing forces working against each other in the actual construction of the buildings. Well, you begin to have the growth of art, and you do have the growth of different kinds of art. You have men's art and women's art. Men are creating sculpture and art. Women are creating women's art, which would be garments, tapestries, woven arts. And here you can see in some of the tapestries, you have a beginning of sometimes showing allusions to fables, to classical myths, to women's work, to work in the house and domestic work. And some of the responses that we have to the times are only in these tapestries that are still found and still preserved. Of course, the material is very, very fragile after 600 or 700 years, but sometimes we do find tapestries that are fully intact, and they do show us how people dressed, what kinds of activities people presented themselves to on daily life, whether or not they were gambling, whether or not they were eating, whether or not they were having feasts, whether or not they were hunting or jousting. All of these activities come through in the tapestries that are created by women. And some of them are very, very beautiful and ornate. And as you can see here in some of the tapestries, we have what's known as the unicorn tapestry and bear tapestries over here, in which we have wild beasts that are sort of serving under a beautiful, wealthy woman. And you have here a unicorn. And there are a number of these unicorn tapestries that really illustrate that the idea of unicorns was a part of medieval thinking. They thought these mythological beasts did exist, and there's no real evidence that we've ever had that there actually were unicorns, but there was a wide belief in them during the Middle Ages. And on the other side here, we have another beautiful tapestry that really refers to a classical allusion here. You have a classical Greek urn, and you have classical cherubs over here. So you have an allusion back to the classical era. And over here you have a tapestry that shows people that are working in the fields, that are collecting the crops. And you have women and men working together, harvesting at harvest time. a woman's way of preserving history and remembering the times. So you begin to have arts growth not just for men but also for women at the same time. You also have fantastic sculpture, and sometimes it's just relief sculpture, but here you have one of the stories in the Middle Ages that really shows one of the stories from the Bible. Again, the Mother Mary, the baby Jesus, and then you have a variety of smaller sculptures behind it, relief sculptures that are coming out from a wall, and these sculptures are actually then engraved in the wall, in which they actually chip away at the stone and the rock, and then they make the sculptures stand out from the wall, so that you actually have a rock or a stone sculpture that's standing out from the actual wall itself, which gives it even more power, because it's not just freestanding, it's a part of a wall, and yet it's something jetting out from the wall. It's almost animated. It almost comes alive to the viewer. Pisano's beautiful pre-Renaissance sculpture. As you can see, Pisano is one of the heroes of the Italian sculpture style, and what he has here is in this beautiful reliquary, where you have, as you can see, these classical, very Corinthian columns. They have really fancy tops at the tops of the columns, and then you have around, what's even more fascinating than the columns is you have the relief sculptures that are built into this frieze at the top. And you have beautiful, even just holding up in the columns, you have beautiful, beautiful little sculptures. Here, for example, looks like it's David. David, always a symbol, for example, for the shepherd, the good shepherd, and he is holding a lamb under his, around his neck. He's sort of holding it up, and he's completely naked, but there is beauty in the physical form and the nakedness of David. He isn't shown specifically for any kind of religious purpose, except that it's a story in the Bible. But David is shown as one of the great kings of Judea, and but he is shown to be beautiful, and he's shown very, very humanistically to be a full-blooded man, but naked. But again, very, very aware of the fact that he is a man of the earth, a man of his people in his time. The Decameron is another a story written in the Middle Ages, and again describing by the life of people in this time, and it's kind of a wild, what they call a ribald tale, R-I-B-A-L-D. Ribald simply means that it's a wild and lascivious tale. There's sex, there's gambling, there's people whoring about and having a great time, as probably many people did during the Middle Ages. People would go to church on Sunday, but they would live licentious lives the rest of the week. Remember, our conception of marriage is today, people get married and then they have children. In the Middle Ages, there was no such conception of marriage. You fooled around. If there was evidence that you had fooled around, if there was a pregnancy, then you might get married, or you might not. So life was very, very different. Again, many people wouldn't get married unless there was something in it for both of them. A woman wanted a husband so that she would have someone to protect her and shelter her. Women, again, had no rights to property in this time, so property always devolved to the male heirs. Female heirs were always looking for a marriage that would provide them with property and with some place to live, and with a husband that would take care of them. Today, situations are quite different. Obviously, women make their own income. Many times women are the sole providers for a household, but in the Middle Ages it was very important and incumbent upon a woman to find a good marriage. For men, marriage wasn't such an important issue. They could marry if they wished to, if they wanted to make money by marrying a wealthy woman, or even sometimes a widow. They could, if they could find a good dowry, they would marry specifically for money. So marriage was a man's game, and it was primarily created to create wealthier men, and sometimes to secure the place of women in families that had wealth. Other than that, it wasn't. Notice, by the way, in this painting that comes from a later period, notice how people are adorned. As you can see, these women are wearing beautiful medieval outfits. The gentleman here with his lute is a troubadour, and he's been playing a song and telling stories to the young ladies, and they're entranced by him. So troubadours would go from town to town in the Middle Ages. They would tell stories, they would sing songs, they would acquire an income by telling stories. They would sort of pass the hat at the end of a session, and if they were good, they could play for princes and nobles and even kings, and they could make a lot of money. For the most part, troubadours were itinerant players who eked out a living by going from town to town, and very often didn't make much money doing what they did. And life was tempestuous. Obviously, travel was very difficult. You had to have horses, you had to have a squire or someone to support you while you were on the road to keep you in shoe leather. You had to make enough money, you had to dress well, you had to look courtly, you had to say the right things, you had to flatter the right people. As it is today, the entertainment business was not an easy business. Here we have Marchant, who is one of the earlier musicians who creates this idea of polyphony, bringing masses to the people to be sung. Polyphony is multiple lines of music being sung by various singers at different levels of tone and different levels of pitch. So monophonic sound would simply be a single note played by a group of people or sung by a group of people all together. Polyphony would be breaking up that note into chords, 3 or 4 notes sang together by a group of people that would create a harmonious sound. So Marchant was one of the first people to really work in polyphonic music, which people thought was a big revolution. Again, in monophonic music, they would just create a series of notes, you know, they would sing a song that would just be a series of notes in an order. But when you were doing polyphony, you had to hit a series of notes simultaneously that sounded good together. So again, in our 12-tone scale system that was still developing, it was difficult to find the right harmonies, the right modes that would make the best and prettiest sound. And frankly, when you listen to Gregorian chant and the music of the Middle Ages today, it sounds a bit strange to us because our music has a lot more variety to it. It has a lot more different tonalities to it. They're using a very limited form of tonality. They're using a very limited form of musicianship, which is all they really had at their time. And as you can see in the picture here, you can see people that are apparently going to a church. It looks like either noble people or priests and nuns that are going to a priest. And it looks like they're going into either a room or a church itself. It might even be a confessional to have absolution, to have confession, and to perhaps have a confession and perhaps to attend a church service. But again, there's this whole idea in the Middle Ages of pilgrimage, that you actually go to churches in your own country, and you can even go to churches in the Middle East so that you can find out more about Jesus and the origins of the Christian church. Unicorn tapestries, again, I mentioned some before. Here's an example of a unicorn tapestry in which unicorns are featured items in the tapestry. Again, we have absolutely no knowledge that actually unicorns ever existed. In fact, they're very likely just a fabled beast that never existed. But we see gobs of tapestries, and we see quite a few mentions of unicorns in the Middle Ages. This may very well be that they might have had visitors that had been to some place like Africa where they had seen rhinos. They had seen an animal that looked something like a horse that had a horn sticking out of its head. Rhino, again, a very ancient beast, you know, a mammal, but still having a horn in its head. Or they might have seen deer, or they might have seen the antlers of an elk, and they might have seen maybe a deer with only one antler, and they might have mistaken that for unicorn. But the mythology of unicorns is quite extensive in the Middle Ages, and they firmly believe that unicorns did exist. And here you can see another scene that really portrays Middle Ages life. You have beautifully dressed courtesans, you have lovely hats, you have velour outfits, you have hunting dogs, you have ladies in waiting with their beautiful medieval outfits, you have gentlemen, again, wearing very beautiful velour outfits. You have people in the background you can see in the town, you can see the spires, you can see the houses, you can see the towers in the background, and again you can see a variety of people, and there seems to be beautiful floral scene here, so it must be a summer or spring day. And you can see people here with sticks. It looks like, I don't know if they're hunting the unicorn, or if there's dogs and there's sticks, and there's some, or if they're just simply corralling the unicorns. But this might be a suggestion that the unicorns were creatures that were becoming extinct, maybe because they were being overhunted. But again, we have no evidence that there actually ever was a unicorn and that any such animal existed, maybe in ancient times, but there certainly is no recollection of that from the Middle Ages. Again, here we have Westminster Abbey, one of the beautiful churches that comes to us from the Middle Ages, and it gives you a strong sense of the British conception of all the towers. And Westminster Abbey is actually rather small inside. Westminster Abbey is where all the kings of England are coronated. That is, that's where they're invested as being the kings of England. And there's actually a chair that they have. You've seen The King's Speech, that movie. There's actually a chair that all the kings sit at when they are invested, and it actually has carvings from the different kings who actually carved their initials in the chair. It's a very simple little chair. It's just a wooden chair. It's nothing ornate. You wouldn't think of it as a chair that actually a king sits on. Westminster Abbey is also a marvelous place for the burial of poets. It's become the burial chamber for almost all the great writers of English history. They're all buried there. And in fact, they ran out of space in Westminster Abbey to bury them underground, under the stones. So they actually began to bury them in the sides of walls and in little tombs that are actually above ground, that are like 4 or 5 feet above ground, actually carved into little spaces in the walls. So there's very little room left in Westminster Abbey to kind of move around, because there's the remains of someone famous on all sides, either at floor level, in a tomb actually on the floor, in the side of a wall, or actually above you in a wall. So it's kind of a crowded space. One of the most famous poets and playwrights who is not in Westminster Abbey is William Shakespeare. Shakespeare was pretty wealthy and pretty famous during his lifetime. And Shakespeare is really a Renaissance figure. He comes from the 1500s in England, so he's really not a part of our study. But just to give you a sense of the power of Westminster Abbey, already by that time period, poets and writers were being buried in Westminster Abbey. And Shakespeare was fairly wealthy and fairly famous, and while he didn't perceive himself as being as great as other people did, he did have a fear that when he died, he would have his bones disinterred and moved to Westminster Abbey. So actually Shakespeare requested that his bones not be moved, and on his tombstone it says, you know, "Curse upon thee who removes these bones from Stratford," because he wanted to be buried and he wanted to stay at Stratford. But Westminster Abbey is a very beautiful location now in downtown London, near Big Ben. There are a lot of protests there. I was there 2 years ago. And during that time, there were protests by Arabs, Iranians, who did not like the way the United Kingdom was treating the Arab states. And there were police there, and it was sort of closed off. But it's a very beautiful location, very solemn location. They have gorgeous jewelry, and things are rather inexpensive in England. You can buy beautiful things for next to nothing. You could get little chain wrist bracelets and all kinds of things that have Westminster Abbey insignia on them. They're quite beautiful. But as you can see, there's a lot of fluted columns in Westminster Abbey. It's a very ornate. It has a nice, beautiful front place to it, and it has lots of spires, and it's very, very ornate. And you can see in the background, there's Big Ben in the background, so you can see how Westminster Abbey is sort of central to the guise of London and what London is like. This is the cathedral at Salisbury. Salisbury Cathedral in Oxford, England, is really one of the most beautiful places to go. It's the largest cathedral in England. It's huge. It really is like sort of a city block wide and long. And Salisbury is a really beautifully preserved medieval village in England. I mean, people like this. I went to it last year, and there are shopping malls and everything downtown and stuff, and there's people driving around little Mini Coopers and stuff, and it's a beautiful location. A lot of junk shops. I bought a couple of Beatle albums in a junk shop for like, you know, £1 a piece, like $1.60 a piece. And it's beautiful, but it's an ancient medieval cathedral, and it's very large, and it's really sort of about 100 miles outside of London, so it really doesn't get as much visitation. So it's really beautifully preserved, but it's really big. It's a big monumental place, and like I say, it takes up about a city block, and you can sort of walk a couple blocks and you'll see it well in the distance. But almost all the roads from the train station lead directly to Salisbury, so you can get around town real easily. I mean, you can walk around the whole town. You don't really need a car. It's quite nice. Just take the train out from London for like 100 miles, then you go out to Salisbury, and then boom, you're at it. It's real pretty. Let's see. Oh, this is everyday life in the Middle Ages, and as you can see, this looks like probably a pregnant woman with her husband on horseback. She's riding side saddle, and he's riding, as you can see, with his legs draped across the horse. This is a contemporary painting, and you can see the horse is beautifully attired. The husband and the wife are very beautifully attired, and they're riding across the countryside, the English plains, and apparently with her headdress and everything, it looks like she's She's deep into her pregnancy, apparently the way she's holding her stomach, which is sort of a symbol of that in that era. And again, it shows the virtues of family. Family was very important, obviously, because it would be very likely that family would be the only support and protection you would have in life in the Middle Ages, not unlike what it is today. Aside from your family, you may not have much going for you. This is another tapestry from the Middle Ages here, and it shows a gentleman here, and he is talking to apparently his wife, and you can see the table is kind of flattened, so the table appears to be a flat surface, but you can see the plates on the table, you can see where they're eating, you can see a dog at the bottom of the table here, and you can see other guests at the table that are there, that are entertaining and are actually a part of their feast. But the dog's here eating the scraps over to the side. There's another dog up here that's waiting for someone to drop a scrap. Looks like someone's cutting bread over here. But I like how they've laid out the table. Instead of making the table like this, they've made the table flat so you can see everything that would be on the table, the plates, and how they actually ate. So this is a very instructive tapestry to let you know a little bit about everyday life in the Middle Ages. This is another tapestry again. This shows sort of a knight, and this shows the squire. The squire is actually the person that sort of helps the knight. He's sort of the obese-looking little fellow over here, little tubby fellow, who is actually helping the knight off of his horse, taking the knight's sword, taking the knight's vestments. A knight is almost like a holy figure. He's a figure invested to try to help the common people and make their lives better. Again, the idea of the knight was the chivalric tradition. The chivalric tradition was that right made might, not that might made right. That is, that if you were righteous, you would be given power by God. If you were not righteous, no matter how much power you had, you wouldn't be able to wield it well. So the knights were supposed to be holy figures that were supposed to serve the will of the church, serve God, and serve the country. And a knight was given squires, people to aid them in their work because their armor is extremely heavy. Some of the lightest armor from the Middle Ages might very well be 80 to 90 pounds. So you're talking about a guy who's maybe 5'9", maybe 160, maybe 170 pounds, if he's in very, very good shape, and he's muscular, and he's wearing 90 pounds of armor, which is probably more than most people bench press. So he's having to struggle with a lot. He has to wear this on a horse. The burden on the horse is extreme, and getting up on the horse and getting off the horse is very difficult wearing armor. Again, in a way, really, Middle Ages combat kind of pales in comparison to Greek and Roman armor, because the Greeks and Romans recognized that being light, and like the Greeks, going back to the old idea of the hoplite, the person that could hop light in a very, very light breastplate, maybe if he had any protection at all, loincloth, maybe a shield, and maybe a sword, and maybe a helmet, and that was it. And that was the max that the Greeks and the Romans, for the most part, fought in. But the Middle Ages warriors wore heavy plated armor, thinking it would protect them from arrows, thinking it would protect them from sword blows. But frankly, it was just so encumbering that it probably didn't do too much to help them. It was more ceremonial, it looked attractive. There is some beautiful armor that shows King Henry VIII from the Renaissance that shows him, and the armor is pretty big, but what's the funniest part of it in the Tower of London, Tower of London was created in the 800s in England, but the Tower of London actually does hold armor for all the kings later, and King Henry VIII's armor is pretty nondescript. He's a pretty medium-sized, like 5'8", 5'9" guy, except that he has this huge codpiece, which is sort of the area of armor that's supposed to cover his groin area, and the suggestion, of course, is because he's the king, he must be well endowed in his groin because he's bigger than all the rest of the guys. Probably not. Probably just was ceremonial. Probably very rarely wore armor at all, except for some ceremony to show that he was the king and he was in charge of all the armed forces. Here we have an example of how the costume of the Middle Ages predominates. Here is a 1520 gown of Mary of Habsburg. This is certainly is a little bit later era, but probably the Habsburgs are a little bit further behind the times. And even though this is a Renaissance gown, and probably with it has a tighter waist, and she actually has a belt here. This gown is probably not too far off of how people dressed in the 11th and 12th century in the rest of Europe. France and England probably would have had gowns like this several centuries earlier. It just took a while for it to get to Germany in the middle European area. The character up in the corner here is Father Cadfael. And Cadfael is actually a popular mystery detective series. Cadfael was played on British BBC TV for about 4 or 5 years by Derek Jacobi, who's a popular British actor. And Brother Cadfael is actually a warrior who's come back from the Crusades, and he knows a little medicine, and he's decided that he's lived sort of a wicked life as a warrior. fighting in the Crusades, and he decides to give up his life to become a priest, a monk, and to go live in a monastery and to practice his healing arts. And of course, in every novel, the novels are by a guy named Ellis Peters, who is actually a female writer, who uses a male writer's name to actually get more attention for her work. And she's been extremely, extremely popular. These books have been very popular. There must be 10 or 20 Cadfael books. And what happens, of course, is in every book, there's a murder that's committed somehow, and Cadfael has to apply his pre-Sherlock Holmesian knowledge of medicine to trying to solve the murder. And every time, of course, he does find the culprit and figures out why and who killed who and how. But all the novels deal with great detail about the Middle Ages and the belief system of the Middle Ages. If I have an opportunity, I'll show you a little chunk of Middle Ages ideas from Cadfael in my next class, if we get time. But Cadfael is a lot of fun to watch because, again, it's kind of a lot of Middle Ages yore, but it's also the story of Cadfael, who is a very bright monk who actually is able to solve crimes, and they're kind of fun to watch. This is, again, Brother Cadfael, Middle Ages monk and doctor in Middle Ages and pop culture. Just give you a sense that even though the Middle Ages is long gone, people still look back to the Middle Ages, especially people in England really are fascinated by the time of the Middle Ages. And so this was a popular TV show, again, for about 10 years back in the 1990s. Brother Cadfael was very, very popular, and you can obtain the DVDs or the videos of the Cadfael shows, and we actually have a couple of them in our library because we, in all of these classes, show these all the time just to give people a taste of the Middle Ages, and it's just fun to watch. And that's the end of my little discussion of later Middle Ages. Hopefully you'll be able to amplify this a little bit more in class when I see you guys on Tuesday, and I might make you one more last tape so it'll help you to study for your exam. Please don't forget to look online to see your list of exam review terms, and I have added to that list, so it's exam 3 that we'll be looking at for your exam. It's going to be on theoretically Thursday, December 13th. But we'll see what Mr. Milligan wants us to do, and we'll take it the best day that's best for your class. All right, so we'll talk to you again on Tuesday, and I hope this tape helps you a little bit understand the Middle Ages. Take care. Talk to you later. Bye-bye.